US as well as all over the world. Most popular being in San Francisco, California, where sourdough bread was introduced after the gold rush, which was like an exciting time in history. So it's nice to hear that the sourdough bread was a part of that time in history. So the sourdough bread actually dates back to ancient Egyptian times, and the bread was made before commercially prepared yeast was available. So these sour starters were used for leaveners, and they're still used today. They're natural, and they don't contain any commercially prepared yeast. Early bakers made sour starters using a liquid, either a milk or water or even a potato water that they made. They mixed it with flour and they let the natural yeast spores of their region grow in this starter, and they would leave it ferment, and then that's what they used to leaven their bread. And these original sour starters are really considered true starters, and true sourdough bread is made with this starter only and not yeast. But a lot of commercially prepared breads these days, and breads prepared in bakeries, sourdough breads, they're enhanced with commercially prepared yeast for consistency. So let's talk about the sour starter. There's two kinds of sour starters. There's a simple starter, and then there's a natural starter. The simple starter is made using commercially prepared yeast, water, and flour. And you mix them together until it's really a loose dough, kind of pasty, and you're going to leave that ferment overnight. And then the next day, you're going to feed your starter, and you're always going to feed your starter using equal parts of water and flour. So you're going to feed your starter, let it ferment for a few more hours, and then it's ready to use. And you can store it in the refrigerator, and you're going to want to keep feeding that starter as it's stored in the refrigerator in the days to come. And then when you pull it out to use it, you're always going to be using your starter at room temperature. So the second kind of sour starter is the natural starter. And that starter contains typically water and flour, and you can use just those two mixtures to capture like natural strains of bacteria and yeast in your area, or you can even speed up the process by adding some grapes or apple peels or potato peels and even onion peels and orange rind too, and that's just going to give your starter a little bit different flavor. So what you'll do is you're going to combine your water and your flour and your enhancer, if you want to use peels or something like that. You're going to leave that ferment overnight. Then you're going to pull out your grapes or peels or whatever you put in there, and then you're going to be feeding your starter again with equal parts of flour and water, and then you'll leave it ferment again. And then you can store that in the refrigerator, and you're going to be sure to pull it out and let it get to room temp before you use it, and feed it again and let it ferment. So these sour starters are really wonderful, and they give this bread so much flavor and texture. And the starters are going to change in flavor from region to region. Like for example, sourdough bread that's made in Italy and France doesn't have any sourness to it because of the yeast and the bacteria in the region. But if you taste a sourdough bread from another region, it's always going to taste a little bit different. So that's the philosophy behind some of the flavors in sourdough bread. The flavor can be very mild and buttery, or it can be very like rich and tangy, just depending on where it's made and what was used to make it. So the acidity in the sourdough bread too is going to actually add to the shelf life of the bread. So keep that in mind. And these breads are very aromatic. They have a very distinct flavor and aroma to them, and they're just wonderful for serving with soups or sandwiches, or even chili is also another great thing for sourdough bread. You can do so many things with it. And you can also make it in so many different shapes and forms. You can do an oval like we have here, and you could do it thickly sliced, very nice, and it's usually typically kind of rustic. You can do squares or you can do rolls, and you can even top them with seeds, or even you can put seeds inside, and caraway is nice too. So even though it's a very, very traditional sourdough bread, you can put your own twist on it. You can add olives and herbs to it too to make it uniquely your own. So let's go back to talking about the starter a little bit since it's so interesting. I have a starter here that I made, a simple starter, and this is typically how it's going to look. I had it in the car a little bit so some of the bubbles came out, but it's going to be bubbly and it's going to be sticky too. And it's just going to typically double and triple in size. So watch for that so you know that your starter is active. And the starter it goes really well with rye flour because the rye flour ferments really well. And in northern Europe, where rye breads are really popular, this starter really was used a lot, and it's used today too because the low pH in the starter, it helps the carbohydrates kind of gel up in these rye breads. So ideally it's perfect for rye bread, and if you find a sourdough bread recipe that includes rye flour, that's even a bonus right there. So we're getting ready to wrap up our sourdough bread discussion, and if you have any questions, please let me know. We have a question.
What kind of container should we store the starter in?
The question is, what kind of container should you store the starter in? You can use a plastic container with a lid. You're always going to want to cover it, especially when it's in the refrigerator. Or I usually like to use a glass bowl. I like to use something that I can see kind of what's going on. You could see a little bit of bubbling here, but the bubbling that you're going to see on the surface is really going to be super obvious. So any container will work, but like I said, I like to use something that I can see what's going on because it's kind of a little science experiment. It just makes bread making so much more fun. So try the sour starters, please. You're going to love it. It's just a super traditional way. It's the original way of bread making, and you should really be getting your hands in that and experiencing it. And the flavor is second to none. So aromatic, distinct flavor. The texture, you're just really going to love it. And we have another question.
Actually, I have several questions, but the first one would be, when you feed it, do you stir it in the flour and water or sprinkle it on top?
Good question. The question is feeding the starter, which is so important. You really have to take care of it once you start it if you want to use it. So when you're adding the flour and the water, you're going to be mixing those in. The question was, do you sprinkle it on top or do you mix it in? You're going to be mixing it in, and then you'll see some of the bubbles disappear, but then they're going to come back. Once it ferments, it's just going to be really active. So make sure that your starter is remaining active, otherwise something is really wrong. And we have another question.
Can I use rye flour to feed it?
The question is, can you use rye flour to feed the starter? You can. Starters are typically made from rye flour or wheat flour. There's just a bunch of different recipes out there, whichever one you like. I think it's great. Some starters call for half wheat flour and half rye flour, and that's great too. But just always keep in mind that you're going to be using equal parts of flour and water to feed your starter. And the amount of flour and water that you're using should not exceed half of the starter because it's just going to be too much for it. It won't be able to keep up. You kind of want to feed it a little bit at a time. So it's actually kind of fun that you have to take care of your starter and feed it from the refrigerator. And another tip for your starter too. If you're not going to be using your starter for a little while, go ahead and add a little bit extra flour. That's going to slow down the fermentation process and help the longevity of the starter. If you need your starter to be active because you need to use it sooner and you're going to be using it a lot, go ahead and add a little bit more water because this is going to help the production of the yeast and make the starter more active. So keep that in mind. More water for a more active starter, more flour for a less active starter. That's a really good tip to keep in mind. And always use water that's room temperature. And we have another question.
How long can you keep the starter?
The question is, how long can you keep the starter? People keep starters for years and years and years, and they're supposed to be original San Francisco sourdough bread starter. So as long as your starter is still active and you're caring for it, you can keep it in your refrigerator for any length of time. But make sure that you're using it and refeeding it and replenishing it. And we're going to be wrapping up soon, and I'd like to take any more questions on the sourdough bread, or you can always email me at bpmentors@escaffeonline.com, or you can call me on the toll-free line 877-452-5489. Be in touch, let me know how you're doing, and let me know if you tried the sourdough bread. I'm interested in hearing it and seeing any pictures that you have. And we have another question.
Two things. One, Kim wanted to mention to you that her starter has been handed down from about 100 years ago from Alaska. And two, Daryl says, does chlorine in the water affect the starter?
We have a comment on a 100-year-old starter from Alaska, and totally believable. The sourdough bread actually traveled from Europe through Alaska, the Yukon Territory, before it actually made its way into the U.S. So yes, totally believable. And then we had a comment on the water for the sourdough starter. Can the chlorine affect the sourdough starter? Yes, definitely. You can use spring water to eliminate any doubts on your water that you're using, and that would be perfect. And also, organic flour is really good for making starters because it's not processed as much and it doesn't have additives, and it's so much more natural. So keep that in mind for your sour starters. So I want to hear how you guys are doing with your sour starters and your sourdough bread. And if you don't have any more questions, I'm going to say goodbye for today, and we'll see you next week. And have a great day filled with good food.